I'll make a quick introduction to the next session and make it really short because just to win more time. Professor Nasser Rabat will lead the next session. We titled the next session X-Glamour, and we've invited the Associate Dean Jonathan Solomon to give the introduction of Professor Rabat and invite Professor Rabat to introduce his lecture.
Thank you. I don't, is this on? Yes, I never envy the job of introducing the introducer, but thank you. At least I no longer introduce the introducer. Right? I've graduated to being the introducer. Good evening. Donald McNeill begins the introduction to his book, The Global Architect, with a reminder that architects have always been travelers. From Bernini's 1665 invitation to Paris to work on the Louvre at the behest of Louis XIV to the 1940 Bauhaus exile to America, McNeill goes on to suggest that the growing role of international consultancy by American firms over the past 100 years is a natural effect of what Magali Larson calls the heteronomy of architectural expertise within a matrix of client, public, media, and politics. Tonight's keynote speaker, Professor Nasser Rabat, is himself a heteronymous figure, historian and architect, cultural critic, and spatial provocateur. The Aga Khan Professor and Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT, Rabat's scholarly interests include the history and historiography of Islamic architecture, art, and cultures, urban history, post-colonial criticism, and the role of human agency in shaping that interplay between politics, culture, and society. In an era in which the proliferation of virtual communications at times suggests that space is no longer relevant, Professor Rabat's work reminds us that the city and public space are as critical as ever to the formation and defense of a civil society. Among his recent articles on the Arab Spring are Circling the Square, Architecture and Revolution in Cairo, The Arab Revolution Takes Back the Public Space, and in Arabic, Our Revolutions Between Freedom and Identity. Professor Rabat's work is a potent reminder that travel is not an end in itself. Whether in an educational curriculum, as in here at Syracuse, or in the practice of architectural consultancy, travel cannot be separated from its political implications. Professor Rabat has published more than 90 scholarly articles and book sections in English, Arabic, and French. His books include The Citadel of Cairo, a new interpretation of Royal Melmoch architecture, Melmoch History Through Architecture, Building Culture and Politics in Melmoch, Egypt and Syria, which won the British Kuwaiti Fellowship Society Prize in Middle Eastern Studies in 2011, and an edited book, The Courtyard House Between Cultural Reference and Universal Relevance. He is currently completing a book on the outstanding 15th century historian of Cairo, Taqi al-Din al-Markizi. You'll have to correct me on it. Forgive me. You'll have to buy the book and find out.
Well, by the time the book is out, the name would be on every lip.
On everybody's lips. By the time the book is out, I will have practiced it sufficiently to be able to pronounce it like a native. And also working on a new survey of Islamic architecture from the 7th to the 21st century, tentatively titled The Story of Islamic Architecture. Professor Rabat worked as an architect in Los Angeles and Damascus. He regularly contributes to a number of Arabic publications and serves on the boards of various cultural and educational organizations. He also consults with international design firms on projects in the Islamic world and maintains several websites focused on Islamic architecture and urbanism. Please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Professor Nasser Rabat.
Thank you. Thanks. I did move this here, and it's, oh, here it is. Is the mic working now? Because I can't hear the mic. I hear my voice only. Well, I should actually first thank Abdurrahman for having invited me, because I guess it was his idea. And he and I go back some time. He has been actually present in so many activities at MIT. We met there, and then we met also at Yale 2 or 3 years ago. But I should also thank the School of Architecture for inviting me to come here and speak about a topic about which I know much less than most of the people who have been invited But as Professor Solomon was saying, as a critic, I allow myself to pretend that I know more. So here it goes. Contrary to received wisdom, the Arabian Peninsula experienced a fair amount of urbanization from as early as classical times, and probably even earlier, especially on its three long coasts along the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, this would be the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea in here, so on all three sides. Small and highly efficient settlements that connected the two worlds of the sea and the desert emerged along the water's edge, or a bit further inland, in what we know today as Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, the eastern and western provinces of Saudi Arabia, and above all, Yemen. In the rather harsh environmental conditions of the region, settlements had to be trimmed down to the most essential function for which they were established in the first place: an interface between constantly mobile human groups, some bringing the bounties of the sea or of faraway lands, and others ensuring their distribution through an intricate network of caravan routes that crisscrossed the sparsely populated desert and linked it to the more urbane and wealthier cities of the north and the south. That is, I'm talking about the Roman period, so we are 2,000 years ago. These legendary Arabian trade centers are known to us mostly through classical texts of geographers and historians, and some, such as Dilmun, El Fau, which you see on your left-hand side, Failaka, Mada'in Salih, which you see on the right-hand side, Petra, Dedan, or Al-Ula, through archaeology and actual physical remains. Their historical role varied, with Mecca becoming the most important of them for its vital historical role as the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad and the most holy city of Islam. But their layout had a common theme: a nucleus, usually in the form of an open and polyvalent marketplace come cult center, like the Kaaba in Mecca, fulfilling the needs for exchange both among the people and between them and their gods, and a royal palace surrounded by residential areas fanning out of the center towards the wilderness outside the space of the city proper. Transitional thresholds between the city and the desert were redundant, as the main function of the city was commercial, and as agricultural hinterland was practically inexistent. If we jump down in time to the present and revisit the same areas, we will find cities, and here I apologize for Todd Rice, who's not here, as the Palestinian poet Samih al-Qasim said in a different context, rising out of the edge of the desert. And by rising, I mean really rising to amazing heights, to the point that one of them, and I need not mention names, has erected a concentration of high-rises that confidently compete with Hong Kong, Singapore, and Shanghai, all much older and significantly larger metropolises. These new Arabian cities are still primarily loci of exchange rather than production, but their range of trading has now expanded exponentially. It is now the entire globe with its sea routes and airspaces. Yet, the cities themselves are still squeezed between the desert and the sea, although modern technology, which they have been exploiting to an ecologically critical extreme, is allowing them to push the desert back and to reclaim the sea in. Their swift expansion has thus been literally predicated upon their ability to equalize the two sharply distinct natural environments they have framed and defined them for so long and to mobilize them both in the service of rapid and sometimes drastic urbanization, fueled by the third natural element that they have in abundance, oil. But as anthropologist Ahmed Qana has pointed out, this top-down hurried modernization is unsurprisingly imagined as a white European upper-class utopia. Of course, there is a long history as well as multi-layered myth stretching across centuries between the trade cities of antiquity and the glamorous cities of today. A past that stamped the region with firm and foundational character, having been the cradle of the Arabs and having become exclusively Muslim since the first century of Islam. It is practically the only region in the world where all the inhabitants had been Muslim. A history that is also diverse and open to the influences coming from across the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, or the Red Sea to the north, east, and west, or from the faraway rims of the Indian Ocean. Yet also austere and a bit mystical due to the looming presence of the desert right behind the horizon. But also a tragic history in which the region that gave Islam to the world had lain for centuries as ignored backwater on the periphery of a succession of Islamic empires whose capitals had been growing so distant and so careless and sometimes so punishing. This is an image of a Saudi princess of the Wahhabi order of the Saud family that actually rules Saudi Arabia today, who was paraded as a prisoner of war in the streets of Cairo in 1812 or actually in 1818, I'm sorry, showing basically the kind of punishment that they were receiving every time that they will revolt against the central authority. In this case, it would have been Istanbul, but Cairo was sending a campaign on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. This intermediary history left very few material traces, mostly ruins of adobe structures that the Arab poets mourn and the wind sweeps back into the sand. But it's alternating layers of short-lived prosperity or glory and long-wretched poverty, of neglect from the distant imperial centers or imminent threat from the surrounding raiding Bedouins, of fatalistic inertia or resolute struggle to eke out a living in the inhospitable desert or the treacherous sea, have carved deep burrows on the collective psychology or the collective psyche of their communities that have not been totally washed out by the bomb effect of the gushing oil in recent times. To the west, emerging as the world center with the onset of modernity, the Arabian Peninsula constituted the periphery of the strange, paradoxically both alluring and repulsing Orient. Accumulated myth, ancient memories of civilizational clashes, vast distances exacerbated by cultural and religious divergences, sometimes even rivalries, and the grand colonial project of the 19th century intensified the strangeness and the exoticism of the Orient. Countless European travelers, artists, poets, and strategists exhibited that cultural distance in depictions that reveal both the fascination with the Orient and the cavalier attitude toward acquiring knowledge about it. That fantastical narrative about the Orient trumped history in articulating the representation of the cities of the Orient, long before observation and documentation became the reliable tools of the new empirical method. But even after the introduction of the empirical method, the grip of imagination and myth remained paramount. They even subsumed observation and documentation and turned them into reinforcements of the fantastic images circulating in the West on the cities of the Orient. Witness, for example, the exclamation of Alfred de Musset, one of France's greatest poets, in his long poem, Namouna, un conte oriental, composed in the middle of the 19th century. This is what he says, my translation more or less. Consider too that I have stolen nothing from the bibliothèque, and that even though this story is set in the Orient, I've said nothing about that. It is true that I myself have never been there, but it's so huge, so far away, with memory. We can claim what we want. Go see it to believe it. If, with a single brush stroke, I had built for you some blue-roofed town, some white mosques, some poetic outburst plated in gold and silver, some descriptions of a minaret flanked by a red horizon and assorted skies, would you have answered, "Are you lying to me?" Even when direct contact and systematic investigation became the norm in the relationship between Western observers and Oriental urban life in the age of colonization, Arab cities remained shrouded in myth and fantasy. The image was so pervasive as to not only permeate literature, art, and the various emerging media of capitalism, from the Exposition Universelle reconstructions to advertisement to cinema, but also actual architectural and urban projects designed by Western architects in the East. Things began to slowly change when the notion of the modern state, with its new institutions and governing mechanisms, appeared under Muhammad Ali Pasha, the semi-independent Ottoman viceroy of Egypt between 1805 and 1848. His patronage in the city, though still personal, autocratic, and rather arbitrary, shows signs of awareness of the role architecture can play in shaping the image of the new state, which he was cunningly building against all odds to be both modern and inscribed within the tradition of Islamic empires, something that we still live with today. If we can identify a first architect who has pioneered the design of a modern Arab architecture, it will be Pascal Xavier Coste, a little-known French architect from Marseille. Coste lived and worked in Egypt as a designer and supervisor of large engineering projects all over the country for almost 10 years, between 1817 and 1827. Muhammad Ali Pasha was hiring French technocrats to direct and supervise the modernizing projects he had launched in the country. Coste was one of the earliest recruits. He planned and constructed irrigation canals in the Delta, factories and mills in and around Cairo, and a telegraphic line between Alexandria and Cairo. He was later commissioned to build palaces and pavilions for a number of European and Egyptian dignitaries, and for Muhammad Ali Pasha himself, you see one of them here, of which little had survived. But Coste's lasting impact as an architect in Egypt did not come from his built projects, important as they might have been, but rather from a book, L'Architecture Arabe ou Monuments du Caire, Arab Architecture or Monuments of Cairo, which he measured and drawn between 1818 and 1826. The book was published in 1837 after his return to France. The measured drawings constituted the repertoire upon which Coste based his Mamluk-inspired style for the design of two mosques, one in Cairo and one in Alexandria, commissioned by Muhammad Ali Pasha in 1821 and 1824, but never built. The detailed analytical drawings of Mamluk monuments seem to have been necessary for this architect who was educated in an academic neoclassical tradition, to make the leap from admiring historical examples to adopting their distinctive elements for design purposes. The two designs for the mosques, in fact, reveal how Khost, with a concern for symmetry and clarity, characteristic of his architectural background, manages to synthesize and order a basic vocabulary for a neo-Mamluk style. His projects anticipated and probably influenced a whole string of religious and public structures constructed in the second half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century all over the Arab world in a style that was historicizing in its inspirations and nationalistic in its aspirations. A number of major Western architects were to follow in the 20th century in designing in the now colonized Oriental countries or Arab countries, whose policies and economies became forcibly tied to the colonial metropolis in the early 20th century. New Delhi, designed by Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker, and built between 1911 and 1931, is one glaring example of a major colonial urban project dressed as an Oriental fantasy. Heliopolis, a much more modest, though no less imperial, garden city north of Cairo, designed by Ernest Jaspar between 1908 and 1910 for the Belgian industrialist Baron Empin, who was the greatest entrepreneur in Cairo at the time, is another. Frank Lloyd Wright adopted a decidedly more romantic approach, probably because he was now designing for an independent state with a national project. Yet, his plan for Greater Baghdad in 1957-1958, which comprised an opera house, museum, a zoo, and a university campus centered on an island in the middle of the Tigris River, is nothing less than a modern Oriental fantasy. Recalling the round city of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur, which was built in the 8th century, the project came complete with an assortment of naive references to what an American raised at the end of the 19th century would have thought of the Orient through his readings of 1001 Night. 100-meter long, gilded statue of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the alleged Caliph of the Arabian Nights, was to be mounted on a spiraling base resembling the Malwiya minaret of the 9th century mosque of Al-Mutawakkil in Samarra, which was the capital of Iraq at the time, to form the northern tip of the island complex. The vertical faces were to depict camels climbing the spiraling ramp, a favorite topos of the Orient. The opera house was to be decorated with scenes from the Arabian Nights, and its perforated dome wrapped around a statue of none other than Aladdin holding his lamp, in addition to two statues of Adam and Eve in the garden, symbolizing the Garden of Eden, which, by the way, archaeology today tells us was in Iraq. All from the imagination of a master architect who implored local building professionals in a lecture he delivered in Baghdad to, and here I'm quoting him, connect to what is deep in the spirit of the place. This brings us back to the Arabian cities of the Persian Gulf. A narrow necklace of supra-urbanized speckles strung together along the vast, arid, and sandy southern coast of the Gulf, from Kuwait to Oman, and passing by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. And you can see them all lit. Kuwait and going all the way down to Oman. This would be the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and here you have Qatar and Bahrain, and then you have here the Emirates, and Oman is actually out of the picture. That these cities happen to be collectively known as the Arabian cities, a name that both recalls the Arabian Nights and fits their current image so snugly, is no coincidence if we were to recall Frank Lloyd Wright's fantasy. Until 2 generations ago, these astonishingly slick, hyper-modern cities were just small, sleepy, fishing and pearling towns existing under harsh climatic conditions. Then they struck black gold. Their wealth exploded, especially after the price hikes following the 1974 oil embargo. And with it, everything else boomed. The cities themselves, most of which had metamorphosed into city-states after the end of the British colonial rule in the 1960s and 1970s, expanded immensely as repositories of the new wealth. But the sudden and immense prosperity generated by the oil did create new urban expectations among their citizens that reveal an uneasy and contradictory mix of ruthless capitalism, ostentatious consumption, cutting-edge technological contemporaneity, and proud and tenacious traditionalism. In the beginning, the pace of change was relatively measured and rather elementary. The first discoveries of oil in the 1940s and 1950s and the unfair concessions imposed by multinational oil companies on Gulf rulers brought in only modest wealth and a little brazen luxury. The cities that have maintained the same patterns of traditional life for centuries started to slowly acquire the basic amenities of modern life. New social and civil services such as schools and hospitals were introduced, and new styles of urban livings were thrust upon a population that had no prior experience of many of their underlying and totally foreign social adjustments. Thus, the Arabian cities of the 1960s and the 1970s exhibited a configuration similar to that of many colonial third world cities that had already taken the high road of modernization, a traditional organic settlement punctured by new access roads and modest civic services, which was surrounded by a new district planned a la European with wide avenues, apartment buildings, or separate villa-type residences and clusters of social, religious, and commercial buildings. Things changed more spectacularly in the wake of the 1970, I'm sorry, I didn't need to move this image, enormous oil price surge. With the massive cash flow and its concomitant socio-economic empowerment, and with the increasing exposure to the cult of consumption, came the desire to develop fast and big in record time to serve the growing population and to satisfy its mounting socio-cultural needs and newly acquired expansive taste, which Beirut, a city that served as the outlet to Gulf Arabs' break from tradition, could no longer fulfill, as it was mired in a nasty civil war between 1975 and the early 1990s. This coincided with the arrival of postmodernism on the world's architectural scene, and the Arabian cities plunged into the new postmodern ethos with verve and gusto, and, as we might say in our politically correct parlance, with a strong psychological urge to satisfy their special needs. The wealth that the cities and their citizens were accumulating, their desire to occupy a more influential position on the world pecking order, their deeply religious and conservative outlook, and their fervent quest for political and cultural identity combined to create a demand for a contemporary, yet historically or imaginarily significant architecture. The 1980s became an opportune moment for architects and developers to indulge in the fantasy of endowing these cities with glamorous architecture. To that end, they incorporated in their otherwise state-of-the-art designs various historical or fabled elements dubbed traditional, Arabian, or Islamic, which they often used as basic diagrams for their plans and facades, or they splashed on the surfaces as ornament. This trend suffused all types of architecture, from new mansions for emirs and sheikhs to grand government-funded civic and administrative complexes built by large international firms, which generated the lion's share of all new projects in the Gulf. They reinterpreted tradition or evocative visual symbols and historical motifs and used them in otherwise ultra-slick designs, such as the gigantic engineering tour de force Hajj Terminal in Jeddah by SOM, designed by Fazlur Khan, in 1982, which was inspired by the Bedouin tent. Or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Riyadh by none other than Henning Larsen in 1982-1984, which employs both the notions of covered souk and courtyard in order to evoke the past. Or the Kuwait National Assembly Complex by Jorn Utzon in 1982, which evokes the sail of the traditional dhow or the traditional boat in the Gulf in a gesture not too different from Utzon's earlier iconic project in Sydney, Australia. More recently, and in a postmodern gesture, IMPay claimed the model behind his Qatar Islamic Museum, which was opened in 2008, to be the bold and simple domed fountain of the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo, which was completed in 1298, whose sectional transitions of pure forms inspired the museum's rotating cubic design. This grand architectural fever continued apace despite short halts caused by a series of momentous events that rocked the world, from the Iranian Revolution in 1979 to the Arab Spring today. It, in fact, grew exponentially under the dual influence of a long brewing economic process and a sudden and unprecedented terrorist act. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the marginalization of almost all socialist politics thereafter emboldened an already rampant global and multinational late capitalism to further extend its search for new and profitable outlets. The Arabian Gulf, awash in cash, relatively underexploited, and eager to diversify and secure its sources of income, presented the perfect combination of willing market and potential partner to global business. The investment opportunities in the Gulf became even more localized after the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. Erratic new financial and security measures and knee-jerk policies, ostensibly aimed at fighting terrorism in the West, caused a partial reorientation of the accumulated oil wealth of the Arabs in Western money institutions. So we are told about $600 billion went back from European and American banks. Some of it began to head back home and to seek easy and reliable investments there. But lacking a skilled labor base, long-term patience, or established norms for sustained and large agricultural or industrial projects, the returning wealth joined the resident wealth in building gargantuan business parks and malls, luxury housing and hotels, and touristic, cultural, and entertainment complexes as investment. Architecture at once assumed the role of branding instrument and spectacular wrapping for these new lavish enterprises, which swiftly sprang up in cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Sharjah, Manama, Riyadh, Mecca, Medina, Jeddah, and Kuwait, as well as other less affluent cities around the region, and broke all previous measures of scale, form, luxury, fantasy, and often purpose and urban vision. In Mecca, the almost completed series of towers called Abraj al-Bayt, or the Tower of the House of God, designed by the large firm Dar al-Handasa, one of those firms that Todd showed you as sort of like the unknown large firms, look like a huge Big Ben. In fact, actually, it's called the Muslim Big Ben, surrounded by smaller towers housing luxury residences and hotels that shock the horizons and dwarf the Haram and the Kaaba in its center to almost spatial and visual insignificance. You can actually tell. This is the Kaaba, by the way. This is where 3 million Muslims a year supposedly go there to circumambulate the building, and you can imagine now its scale to the new residences rising there. Dubai, with its entrepreneurial spirit, unrestrained economic laissez-faire, and aggressive pursuit of investments, was the first to ride the new tide and to eventually guide it, and ultimately to fall under the weight of its overextended ambition after the global financial crisis hit in late 2008. The entire city, its surrounding desert, and even its coastal water became the world's most phenomenal visual laboratory, where the only check on architectural and urban flights of fancy seems to be the unbridled ability of the architects to push the limits of size, height, eccentricity, and desire, and the willingness of their patrons to bankroll those fantasies. Thus, we see artificial islands in the form of palm trees with extended fronds meant to multiply the buildable beachfront of the city many folds. By the way, it has 40 miles of beachfront. Supposedly with these islands in here, it will jump up to 1,100 miles of beachfront. You can imagine the amount of money that you can generate from selling beachfront property. We see a collection of little artificial islets dredged from the Gulf sand and arranged in the form of a Mercator projection of the world as seen from a satellite, which are marketed as the exclusive playground for the world's most powerful or perhaps most ostentatious players. We see a collection of strangely shaped skyscrapers that compete in number and height with Manhattan, Shanghai, or Hong Kong, with the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, formerly known as the Burj Dubai, rising to the incredible height of 828 meters, or 160 stories in their midst. We see a water-themed luxury hotel, appropriately named Atlantis, complete with exotic fish tanks everywhere. We see a sky slope inside a mall in a city in which temperature never reach, I would say, 60, perhaps is the lowest that you can get. And many other fantasy projects aimed at achieving a wow effect. In this make-believe milieu, the architecture of what Mike Davis called the utopian capitalist city seems to have emerged as a tacit design objective shared by the architects and their patrons to lure in more investors in a financial cyclical scheme that seems to have recovered some of its steam after the crash of 2008, though it is too early to tell. Thoughtful regionalism, traditionalism, revivalism, and even postmodernism were hastily given up in favor of a new excessive architecture that loudly, and often too loudly, bespeaks the ambition to endow a global pursuit of luxury aimed at the wealthy with a fabulous imagery that Joseph Rickwert matter-of-factly calls the Emirate style, equating the perception of the place with the designation of its architecture. This is most stunningly represented by the self-styled, most luxurious, tallest, and the only 7-star hotel in the world, the Dow-evoking Burj Al Arab Hotel in Dubai, designed by Tom Wright of W.S. Atkins in 1999, which lavishly exploits all the cliches of the fabulous Orient in the service of the super-wealthy jet-setters. The Dubai syndrome spread to other cities in the Gulf, such as Bahrain, Kuwait, and Doha, and you see Doha in here, and beyond into the major cities of neighboring countries that cannot sustain this kind of financial, urban, or social extravaganza. The syndrome usually manifests itself in two variations, which are sometimes combined in one. First, super sleek high-rises competing to cut a particular futuristic profile above the skyline of the city, or an exclusive excursion down some gilded memory lane of an imaginary but recognizable Oriental splendor. As example of the former, the Al Faisaliya Center, built between 1997 and 2000 and designed by Foster and Partners, and the Kingdom Tower, built in 2002 and designed by Ellerby Beckett, have become iconic symbols of Riyadh. As for Oriental luxury, the Emirates Palace Hotel, which cost $3 billion to build, completed in 2004 and designed by John Elliott of Wimberley, Allison, Tong & Gu, actually ups the Burj Al Arab Hotel 1, if that were at all possible, in its deployment of forms, themes, materials, spaces, colors, and silhouettes in the evocation of a fantastic gilded and Arabian Night-inspired Oriental palace. Some cities are trying to taper the seemingly unstoppable Dubai effect by investing in culture and education as counterparts to the naked commercialism of business and luxury apartment towers and cavernous malls, and as long-term social enrichment projects. Two, Abu Dhabi and Doha have made major strides in both areas recently. Abu Dhabi, for instance, is pursuing several new campus projects and a very ambitious cultural mega project on Saadiyat Island, as we have seen with Todd, which will have, now we are told 3, but initially there were going to be 4 world-class museums, 1 performing arts center, and a study abroad campus for New York University planned by Raphael Vignoli. The first museum is the Guggenheim Modern Art Museum designed by Frank Gehry. The second is the Abu Dhabi Louvre for classical art designed by Jean Nouvel. The third is the Maritime Museum by Tadao Ando. And the fourth is Sheikh Zayed National Museum by Foster and Partners. The last iconic building is a performing arts center designed by Zaha Hadid. All these projects have yet to identify their audience, respond to their expectations, and build their cultural and social missions. As of now, there are still mostly shimmering images blipping on the computer screens of scores of swooning potential investors, architects, and students of architecture around the world. All were deliberately commissioned from international star architects as a way to encapsulate the glamour associated with these world-famous designers in the actual buildings of the museums they designed, and as a branding strategy aimed at giving the city a competitive advantage in a global struggle for the interconnected features of media attention, tourism, and investment of capital. Culturally, they were perhaps also meant to tacitly present the sensational envelope as the aspiration and potentially the substitute for the still unclear content and unresolved tension embedded in the scale, extravagance, and ambiguous social functions of the museums themselves. And I want you to just read here. The souk, which means the marketplace, cultural exchange is at the center. This bringing capital and culture together is what these museums were trying to do. This hasty and hungry process of expansion and luxurification of the Arabian cities, however, has its harsh consequences. Among its first architectural victims were the remnants of the traditional or the early modern urban fabrics in these cities. They were almost totally erased, both to erase the memories of the days of poverty and to make way for new, more profitable development. Musharib, that you saw in the lecture of Todd Rice in Doha in Qatar, is here. And it used to be this, and now it is being built as the new urban center of the city of Doha. The process also brings to a sharp relief the contrast between the lifestyles of the wealthy natives and the huge masses of poor labor, imported mostly from Egypt and South and Southeast Asia, who are crowded in ill-kept camps or dilapidated rental neighborhoods. The imbalance that many developing cities suffered from in the post-colonial period, with the flight of the bourgeoisie from their old centers and their replacement by poor rural immigrants, is being experienced in a much more pronounced way in the Arabian cities. Like the rural immigrants in the old colonial cities, the workers in the Arabian cities are poor, unskilled, and discriminated against. But unlike the rural immigrants, the workers in the Arabian cities are actually foreign. They share neither language nor culture with the native privileged population or with the professional expatriates, who are mostly white European and American, who come to work for a short while in those cities. Nor are these workers granted any civic rights in their host countries. They're actually absolutely suppressed. The grave problems that this situation has created have yet to be resolved, actually even to be addressed. The effects of the economically unfair conditions are felt more severely in the older and poorer neighboring cities that are directly influenced by the fluctuation of jobs, investment, and spending in the Arabian cities. We witness the proliferation of Dubai-style exclusive new cities around these older cities, such as Cairo, or in their commercial cores. This development is deepening the decay of the old cities' historic centers, already suffering under the weight of severe population explosion and heavy rural immigration, accompanied by an assortment of governmental neglect and corruption, greedy real estate market, and chaotic zoning and overbuilding. But the most alarming effect of this relentless movement of people and capital is neither architectural nor urban. It is rather the fading away of the old city's civic quality that was slowly and painstakingly acquired over the last 2 centuries, and their transformations into a collection of villages or ruralized metropolises where people live by their wits and devices, cut off from the authorities, the law, and often each other. When the Arab Spring erupted in 2011-2012, it was partially a response to these conditions, and it promised to change the entire makeup of the Arab world. And although its aftershocks are still brutally shaking the region, they have had surprisingly little effects on the Gulf states, although we have seen a few shy ripple effects recently in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain in particular. In fact, the expensively acquired image of glamour seems to be marching on unabated, though not untarnished. When in 2010 it was announced that Sex and the City 2 will be partially filmed in Abu Dhabi, its director Michael Patrick King said, and here I'm quoting, "I thought about where there's a lot of money with no shame attached. Then I thought about the Middle East because of Dubai and Abu Dhabi and their extravagance. It is the new Middle East and it is the future." Complications soon arose, and the conservative powers of the United Arab Emirates ultimately prevented the filming in Abu Dhabi. So the crew went to Morocco instead. Yet, in a trailer for the movie, Sarah Jessica Parker's character, Carrie Bradshaw, sighs, "I think we need some glamour." To which Samantha elatedly responds, "1 week in Abu Dhabi, all expenses paid for all 4 of us, I can hear the decadence calling." Will the fantasy hold on? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nasser. So I'm going to open up the floor for any questions for anyone who's...
Thank you very much for your talk. It was great. You spoke about the aspirations of the Arab nations for building a particular type of Western mimicry of cities. And I don't think you were downplaying the importance of aspirations, how important that is for especially the workers, probably. I would imagine that they would support those cities even more than the rich to build in the way that they're building. And what I would like to hear from you is the alternative to the type of building that are supported by the royalties. And as long as the organization and the funding comes from the same place, it would be a repetition of the same type of aspirations. Who do you think should build in order to imagine a new type of aspirations?
Thank you for the question. It allows me to actually go into an area that in schools of architecture we usually try to avoid going into, and that is the limits of architecture. Architects tend to think that they can be actually social problem solvers. They're not. Architects are service providers. Architects work for their patrons, and the patrons dictate what architects are going to do. There has been, in the last 20 or 30 years, an attempt among some architects to actually break that cycle and to be able to garner funding that doesn't come with the desires of the patron to aggrandize themselves, to build luxurious buildings or whatever. I am organizing a conference in 10 days in MIT, in case you are around there, called The Right to Architecture. And it's actually to address exactly that issue. And I've invited few architects who have done ways of generating funds for projects so that the projects can still hire an architect without having to depend on a patron and the whims of a patron. That's the whole idea. Because I did mention a little bit on the period in which architects actually approached the possibility of answering the question that you are asking, which I would say was between the First and the Second World War, when Europe was rebuilding, when Europe was actually starting to reinvent the notion of having to house all of these people because of socialist policies. And I'm saying socialist as opposed to communist policy. We're looking at Western Europe in a sense in here. That was the period in which it was possible to say that the client is a larger population rather than a patron or a representative or an entrepreneur or an investor, basically the capitalist individual or group of people. So I would actually answer your question by saying we either have to see the political dimension of what we are dealing with and perhaps actually respond to it politically before we are able to address it design-wise, or we are going to have to accept the fact that we are service providers, like fashion designers, like, I don't know, drink designers, perfume designers. I mean, this is basically what these architects are. They are exactly that. They are providing luxury and taste for people who have money. So as long as this is what we are dealing with, and if we accept that this is what we are dealing with, we can sort of like compete, if you want, then on the formal, the aesthetic, the contextual, whatever it is. But without addressing the political issue, it's impossible to actually answer your question by changing, if you want, the client or the patron. We need to revise the whole idea of what's the relationship of designer to patron.
Thank you so much for the fantastic lecture. It was incredible. I wanted to follow up on Yutaka's question and on your response to her. And I read in your response a certain kind of obvious cynicism to the role of activism in design. You kind of say that it doesn't really exist in this context, which is obvious. My question is, what is the space for activism, and where are the moments where such an activism can be realized in the post-Arab Spring context. You hinted to the fact that there's been surprisingly little impact of the Arab Spring on the Gulf states. I wonder if you could speculate a little bit more as to, what are the kind of reasons for that, or also what came across in your lecture very strongly was the incredibly strong connection between patronage and architecture that seems to have a very, very long history in the Gulf. If there are moments of breaking that, or of even questioning the hegemony of the political enterprise that has been there for the longest time in the area.
Your question is a perfect illustration of the point that I was making in my answer, the question itself and the way you phrase your question. I don't know if you noticed that in your question you wavered between design as activism and political activism as activism. And what I was actually answering is that what is the difference? If you are going to speak about design activism, it seems to me that you cannot speak about design activism devoid of social, political, and perhaps cultural commitment. I mean, I'm saying cultural, say, for example, gender policy under a cultural rubric. So to go back to you, I actually am not denying the possibility of design activism, but it has to recognize its political basis. There is no activism without a political commitment, without a political vision. You cannot say I'm actually an activist in terms of improving the kind of material that is being built in the project, but I'm not questioning at all the aim of the project, the funding of the project. So if designers are to be activists, what I'm trying to say in here, and I didn't say it necessarily in the lecture, and it has nothing to do with the Arab Spring, by the way. This has to do with the way architecture has developed since the Second World War, and basically the retreatment of architecture from social commitment. I'll give you an example. MIT had 2 social sciences as professors when I was a student there in the early 80s. We have none today. We had an economist as a professor in the School of Architecture. We have none today. They have been replaced by people who do fabrication and animation of architecture. Representation of architecture is what we are doing today. So no one is questioning why is this architecture being designed. And most of the activism is at this point in time reduced to environmental activism because it can come with little political price, because you are not actually going out and challenging the social order of the society. You are challenging perhaps actually businesses that are already, because of the strength of the green movement outside, are already under attack. So it's very easy. It's like people who started, for example, condemning smoking in the 1980 and the 1990. It was easy. Smoking has already been proven to be wrong, so you could actually come out and score some political stand. It's very difficult today to go back to architecture as it used to be in the early part of the 20th century. And the reason for that is that socialism was defeated as a political system. There's no other explanation for it. I mean, we have rampant capitalism, triumphant, that is out there saying, this is how I want to design the world. So to go back now to the last point of the Arab Spring, I was actually, when Professor Solomon was introducing the 3 articles that were all published more than a year ago. I haven't published anything in the last year because I am now at the position of saying, where are they going? Initially, it had all of that hope of sort of like the possibility of some sort of a liberation. Today, it's not very clear where they're going. So I actually don't see, at this point in time, any liberation in the real sense of the word coming out of the Arab Spring. And therefore, perhaps actually, this is why it is not affecting the rich communities in the Gulf. The other possibility, of course, which we know, is the Gulf rulers have been bribing their population. So the population, and here by population I go back to Todd, those of you who were there, they're bribing 10% of the population, suppressing 90% of the, or no, actually let me be, I mean, this is all estimates, of course. Somebody, a social scientist might jump and say you're wrong, and I might. But 10% of the population is a native population, it's being bribed. It's being bribed ad nauseum. I mean, they are supported all the way, they don't have to pay for taxes, their education is free, their health coverage is free, and so on and so forth. And I would say about 60% of the actual population is isolated and devoid of any rights, political or otherwise, and the 20 or 30% are bribed by high salaries, and these are either European or American or people from my own background, basically from Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. These are the people that are making good living there. And in return, they shut up. They don't open their mouths because they are actually foreigners. They are treated as you have no right in there. So the political contour of what's going on, and this applies, by the way, to architects as well, is very difficult to break without a clear articulation of a liberation movement, which is not happening because of the Arab Spring. We thought it was happening initially.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I just wanted to further ask, I'm not really knowledgeable about this subject, but just the fact that how similar do you think, like why don't architects question the similarity between this rampant capitalism and like that similarity to rampant socialism, which is all like trying to achieve this kind of utopia that is doomed to fail, and this architecture that you showed, like my instinctual reaction when you show these images of like this almost like perfection, like in like all these monumental buildings, I was scared. I was like really like nervous that like this was going to like fester into like a problem. And why is it that after overcoming, 1984 and overcoming that kind of Red Scare, why don't we as, well, not we as architects, but like why don't architects actually question this, what they're actually doing in terms, and rather than just like, this is my design, I'm trying to promote an idea without thinking about the consequences it may have on this kind of rampant capitalism that you speak of?
This is an extremely complicated question because it has to take us to sort of like dissect the history of modern and postmodern and contemporary architecture and its relationship to its sources of funding. And you're right. I mean, the Red Scare is no longer there, so we can go back and perhaps actually look at what is beneficial of some sort of social policies to architects. The last bastion of the Red Scare died today, so in a sense, perhaps we are now free to go back and revise what happened. I'm speaking about Margaret Thatcher. I don't know if you know, but she died today. Margaret Thatcher, and here we have Ronald Reagan, her counterpart, are the people that basically eliminated a social commitment on the part of the government. And it was in the accusation that socialism failed. Socialism did not fail. Communism failed because it was an oppressive political regime. Socialism in Norway and Sweden and Holland is actually doing quite well. And people there are still the best educated, the best well taken care of. They pay a lot of taxes, but I don't see them actually running down the street shouting against their government. They seem to be doing okay. I might be wrong. I haven't really checked, but perhaps Sonia could actually correct me if she wants to. But it seems to me that we have to, and this is something that hasn't been done, write the political history of architecture. That is, what's the relationship between the political order and architecture? How did architects respond to the political order? We have all heard few things here and there. For example, there has been a little bit of a brouhaha on how some of the paragons of modern architecture did not question the oppression of the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union and went all and competed in the palace of the Soviets. We all probably have studied Corbu's design for that. And Corbu went to Moscow, had absolutely no question to ask of Stalin, who at the time was killing millions of Soviet citizens. So we do have those episodes in which some historians, for example, post-colonialism, has unveiled a lot. I showed you Frank Lloyd Wright, but I can show you plenty of other examples, Corbusier in particular, actually, the Opus plan of Corbusier, which passed for a second in here, and I decided not to say anything about it, is another example of where architects were complicit or in some instances blind. I mean, perhaps they were aware and complicit. Perhaps they were, in the case of Corbu, I'm 100% sure he was racist, period. But in the case of others, Frank Lloyd Wright in particular, I actually called him naive. I think there's no racism involved in his design. It's just that this is what he thought the Orientals would like, to have a statue of Aladdin. My hope is that your generation would actually take out that blinding effect of the study of architecture in the narrowest context possible and start seeing it as a social function that has a much larger connection and implications. So we haven't done it. My generation actually has busied itself studying architecture formally, stylistically, contextually, and in some instances theoretically, but theoretically at the level of debate over relationship between form and surroundings. Sometimes environmental, sometimes actually highly structural.
I just wanted to say thank you for speaking about Dubai in that way.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah,
I can't hear you.
I want to say thank you for actually mentioning about Dubai, because as a resident, I've actually witnessed what it's like, this whole social complexity. And I think that the way you approach it as a political activism is true. But as a person that lives in that area, I feel like it's more of a social matter, because people have accepted these divisions in the society over there. They've accepted I'm an expat, I may leave tomorrow, I may not work here. And so they don't fundamentally care. And not just that, people aren't educated because the media is suppressed. There's no such thing as an awareness of how the workers live, or an awareness of how the architecture plays a major role in society. People assume architecture is for architects and not for the mass. So people don't mind. They want the glamour, because every time you watch a TV show, they mention Abu Dhabi or they mention Dubai, but no one really knows behind what the real city is like. And I agree that you're right with the political activist part, but would you not think that, like you said, in architecture schools, we focus on representation more than economic matter, but couldn't our focus on representation actually shed light onto these actual social and political problems?
Well, I'll start my answer first by saying that there's no separation between social and political issues. Political issues happen in society, and social issues are political by nature. So if you are going to actually say, I'm going to limit my activism to a social activism, you're already involved in politics, whether you know it or not. Political activism doesn't mean that you have to run out and carry your red card and say, this is who I am. Political activism is actually anything that you do in order to challenge the order that you feel is inequitable or unfair. So the order, it doesn't need to be a political order. It doesn't need to be that you don't have a vote. It could be that you have no right to drive a car. I mean, that's not political, supposedly, but it's political. So if we establish that you could actually work on either ends and both of them are interconnected, then perhaps we solve the first half of your question. But the second half of your question is what is very problematic to me. And that's, in a sense, the essence of my first two answers, is that the answer to your question is no, we cannot. That is, if we are going to just focus on architectural, representational, proportional, whatever, geometrically related or contextually related, that is the environment, how do we respond to the climate and so on, then we are missing the most important dimension of architecture. Architecture is to shelter, and shelter is for the people. And if we are not actually looking at how shelter is being provided for the people, we are overlooking aspect of what architecture is. I am not asking you to do that. I personally don't do it. I actually, as Professor Solomon introduced me, have functioned for the last 10 years as a consultant in the Gulf. So I am complicit in exactly what I'm criticizing in here. We all are. I'm saying that we are living in a moment in which this kind of activism has been somehow transformed or somehow substituted by a different form of what we call today architectural theory or architectural criticism. It is deliberately avoiding the political issue. And I don't think that this will work. If we are going to critique what we are looking at, if we are going to accept it, then we can actually go to the second level of analysis and start saying, I am interested in seeing whether this building looks better than the other building. But I didn't get to that point.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you have any examples of sort of sparks of hope, either projects or examples of differing attitudes and different regimes in the Gulf region, or perhaps other developing nations who are doing a better job with this, that we might look to, or that the students might think of as models for how they might approach a problem like this? I'm well aware the answer might be no.
No, actually quite the opposite. I am failing to convey the point that I'm trying to convey. Actually, all of these projects are worthy of study from a pure architectural perspective. That is, I can actually spend the semester, by the way, I taught a seminar on Doha, on Dubai, and on Abu Dhabi at MIT. So I have actually looked at these things from an architectural perspective. And it is possible, if the idea is to actually look at how architects are responding to very well sanitized and defined problems. I mean, Musharraf project that we looked at, I don't know if you were here for Todd Rice's lecture, but Musharraf project that we looked at actually did address all the aspects about how do you relate to your environment, how do you divide the space equally between the different classes that are going to occupy it, how you are going to create architecture that will respond to different level of income inside one highly developed and extremely well designed, by the way, beautiful as a matter of fact project. The one thing that I can't be blind to, I was a consultant on that project. The one thing that I cannot be blind to is the fact that that project replaced the only place where South Asian in Doha have an outing. Now, as Todd was telling us, they are all bussed outside of the city and they are in their camps. They have no transportation for the night. In the morning, they are all gathered and brought back to their working sites, wherever those workings are. It's not just construction, everything else. So I cannot not see the unfairness of the project, even though if we are going to reduce it just to an architectural analysis, if you don't think that this used to be the place, this used to be the lung for the 400,000 South Asian workers that live in this 1.5 million city, then we can actually present it in a School of Architecture. I did. I taught a seminar around it. But all I'm saying in here, in relationship to looking at what's going on in the Gulf, as a microcosm of what's going on in the world, as a condensed form, simply because of the concentration of capital in there, and the interest in, not the interest, it's actually the limited possibility of capital to grow in anything else but in real estate in the Gulf, no industry, no agriculture, and so on. Therefore, it actually gives us an extremely good experimental site to start seeing how architecture in general has actually divorced itself from the social content. How?
Urban decay. What's the lifespan of such projects? Agendas.
I mean, let's not just exaggerate it. It's not just the Gulf area. I came to this country in 1980. I went to UCLA. And at the time, this was immediately after the Iranian Revolution. There were 200,000 Iranians who are called in Persian Taghuti, which means actually followers of the oppression, in a way. People who actually immigrated to this country all became American citizens within a year and all started investing in high-rises on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. There were about 20 high-rises empty in the early 80s. There were investments, again, capital looking for ways of investing, not knowing what to do other than to build buildings. So it's an international... In exactly the same phenomenon, there are towers that are totally empty, totally. And I mean, Dubai went through 2007, 2008, where a lot of the towers were unfinished. They stood there as hulks. Some of them were finished and not used at all, and others were actually reappropriated for other purposes. As a matter of fact, I supervised a design thesis at MIT on what to do with all of these vacant buildings. But your question leads to actually something else. The urban dispersion of these cities has nothing to do with the vacancy. because even if they were to occupy the buildings that are being built, there is no master plan that is applied in any of these cities. Even Dubai, the way I showed it, this was the master plan, by the way, that was produced in 2006-2007. There's yet no idea of zoning except for the Jabal Ali area, which is the industrial area. And the speculation for investment was constantly pushing out. I mean, the same phenomenon that we have here of sprawl, you have to imagine happening there, but happening on virgin land, happening on land that has not been occupied before. So if you are looking at an urban disaster, you don't need to wait for the empty towers to witness it. It already is embedded in the splashing of the new development over a huge area. You actually drive half an hour between one area and the other in some of these cities into vacant land. There's nothing. No. Yeah, perhaps. I mean, money transactions perhaps for the center of the city. But the idea of suburban sprawl is exactly there as it is here, except that there it's multiplied because providing water and maintaining the green spaces is much more expensive than it is in places where you have water and rain and the weather is better. But the centers that have been emptied and rebuilt are really, at least so far, so perhaps actually you're right, perhaps there's a cycle in there. That is the 1960s cities have been deemed to be poor representation of the kind of image that the states and the citizens want for themselves today. So those are being destroyed everywhere. So there are areas where you will drive in Kuwait, say for example, and you will see areas that are being emptied and removed for new development. But as that is happening, you are actually moving in urban ruins. They are there. So.
And they're like 5 years old, 10 years old?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So I have no explanation for it beyond the fact that there is really no master plan at work. And again, it's building as speculation, building as investment. So if it's reduced to that, then you cannot stop building from moving into some place irrespective of what the urban conditions are or what the expectations are. I'm not actually, but if you're tired, we can stop.
That was a fascinating lecture. Thank you. One thing that's kind of interesting that, you know, I've studied Islamic architecture in a slightly different context, looking at it typologically, and that if you look at what Islamic culture is, that it's by nature very transitory, because it is based in the Bedouin culture of traveling, the caravans, and kind of those kind of mystic images.
I disagree, but we can talk about that separately.
But I think that there is this tendency of Islam to travel, that it is very well built to travel, initially at least. So you see how it manifests itself in different parts of the world. Now that's really interesting that all of a sudden we're in this new transitory phase in the Arab world with protest, because protest by nature is very transitory. Do you see any examples, especially when you were started talking about the ruralized metropolis, about how maybe that can be architecturalized, that let's say we do keep the social and political content of our society as first, and then we bring in design. How can we start to architecturalize things that are temporary, like protest? And how can we start not necessarily turning, you know, Tahrir Square into a building or making more squares throughout the Middle East, but instead turning it as a platform for urban research and starting to think more about urban planning and zoning laws and ordinances for architecture, learning from the Arab Spring and Tahrir Square?
I'll skip on the first part of your question because I totally disagree, but as I said, we can actually have that discussion separately. But I'll go back to your second part of the question. There had been attempt, and one of the strategies that had been used, especially in older cities, and perhaps actually to go back to your question, is to introduce the notion of critical conservation. Something that I have seen happening in few examples, but the one example that I'm very familiar with, because it was sponsored by the Aga Khan, who also pays my salary, is the Aga Khan project in renovating the section in Cairo called Ad-Darb al-Ahmar, which is one of the oldest and the most dilapidated parts of old Cairo. And for 13 or 14 years before the revolution in Egypt, the Aga Khan had invested. Initially, what the Aga Khan did is he built a park in an area that used to be the garbage dump of medieval Cairo, not of modern Cairo. So it is actually an archaeological park of sorts, because it was where the city for about 1,000 years dumped its stuff outside of the walls of the city. So there are mountains now there of basically decomposed garbage that in the late 80s, the US aid helped the Egyptians by building 3 strategically positioned water tanks under this. But it was actually an awful area, because with all the sandstorm, the sand would move into the city. The walls are no longer there. And right behind the area where the medieval walls were is this very dilapidated neighborhood, which was also the center of drug commerce in Egypt, in Darb al-Ahmar that I'm telling you about. So the Aga Khan initially started with building just the park, and then he decided to work on the restoration of the wall. And then little by little, they started thinking about how can we bring the neighborhood behind it into step, if you want, with the fact that we now have a park, a first-class park, in a place that used to be just garbage dump. And now we have a 12th century wall that is exposed. And some social concerns started coming in. So the project was in keeping the population, which is something that hasn't happened before, in its place. Normally, every conservation project of historic center of cities usually kicked out the population, because they are usually the poor now, with the bourgeoisie fleeing in the early 20th century into the new European style neighborhoods. So you have mostly rural individuals moving in. The image of Cairo is actually quite a good image in that sense. So what the Aga Khan, it's called the Aga Khan Historic Cities Program, and it's based in Geneva. And then they had a branch in Cairo that was restoring those 18th and 19th century buildings in ways that would make them actually very attractive to new investors. But what they were doing is that they were renting units outside of the city, sending the people living there for the 6 months that the restoration would take, and then bringing them back with same rent. The rent is just unbelievably low in there. The project looked like a coffee table case study. People used to come to Cairo in 2005, 2006, and will be taken there to look at it and so on. The revolution happened. The Aga Khan pulled out before that because of financial problems. The project slowed down. The revolution happened. Now there is no zoning, no nothing. People are free to do whatever they want. So the buildings that used to have 3 or 4 stories, all restored beautifully to their 19th century neo-Baroque style, and lived in by the same poor people that lived in them before, are now 10 stories. They added 6 or 7 stories on top of them, because they realized that they have a view over the park. And so all these buildings have been added. And I don't know if you hear about that, but Egypt is very prone to building collapsing, because there are no ordinances controlling how much you build. And some of these buildings are probably going to collapse on the people living in them. I mean, they're chronic. They happen every month or so. There's a building that collapses and kills a couple of dozens of people in there. And it's almost an acceptable part of the cycle of life. So the project at this point in time is a failure, even though at the time, and the whole notion of sort of like a critical conservation is basically to restore the infrastructure and the suprastructure of neighborhoods that have been invaded by the poor classes. And instead of turning them into tourist attractions, which happened elsewhere in so many cities, Fez is an example, Aleppo and Damascus in Syria are another example, Beirut with the restoration of the old city center of Beirut, the late 19th, early 20th century city center, has been moved from where you had the lower class commercial activities to now sort of like only people from the Gulf can afford going to the shops in downtown Beirut today. If you own this apartment and I restore it for you, you're not going to turn around and sell it to someone else and change the composition of the neighborhood. That's one way of actually answering your question. But again, you mentioned the revolution. There is that impulse to liberation, but there's also an impulse to chaos, and that's what we are seeing today.
Yeah, as I guess my question would be appropriate for the end of the discussion, but from what I can tell now, that the Gulf region kind of this architecture is based on decadence. That is like the key word for their architecture. But there are two factors so far that are starting to take, they're starting to take hold of the Middle East. And that one, well, the Gulf region specifically, one is that oil depletion. Like, oil is not going to last forever, of course. So in about 50 years, it's going to cease to exist as, a source of capital. And then the other factor is that they're starting to become like political, social changes where like basically there's a class uprising and all that. And I was just wondering if you had any predictions as to what these two factors like what kind of architectural forms these two factors will generate for the future of the Gulf.
As to the first question, when I was 10 years old, those of us who grew up in the poor part of the Arab world were always envious of those of you who grew up in the rich part of the Arab world. So as a compensation, we used to sit there and say, look at what will happen to them when the oil is depleted. And the prediction in the 1970s was that the oil would be depleted by early 80s. This didn't happen. Here we are, 2013, and now the prediction is that it will last to 2070. So it's a bit too early to write the death knell of the economy there that are based on oil. Of course, the latest fashion now is the shale oil that is coming out of Canada and the US. They are going to become independent, and therefore Saudi Arabia will not find anyone to buy its oil. Of course, nonsense. I mean, China is hungry for that oil. So Saudi Arabia is going to be wealthy for the two next generations. So will Abu Dhabi and so on. Don't worry about the known reservoirs of oil will last them for at least 2 generations. So they still have 2 generations to make do for the mistakes that they have done so far in terms of where are you going to invest your wealth and how are you going to invest your wealth in sustainable ways for after the depletion of the oil. The second point is you who have to answer it, Mariam, not me. You're the youth of the Gulf. You are the ones that are going to have to change that Gulf, if it is going to be changed. Of course, the interesting thing about it is that this has happened. Now, your parents' generation have already been educated. So we are no longer actually, the idea of ignorance as the reason why people are complacent is no longer a valid excuse. At this point in time, perhaps actually, the complacency was a complacency of the good living. Now perhaps the new generation is coming out with more demands of freedom, of self-expression, and so on. So perhaps this is the route that you could pursue. But this is really totally dependent on the youth of the Gulf, because who else is going to do it?
Sentences to conclude this session, but I felt that this would be a really good end to end today's session. And it's just beautiful how the lecture encompassed so many things: the social political network and the prospects for the future, and the glamour factor that is worth investigation. So it is truly an honor to have Professor Nasr today, and Sonia, and Todd, who left. And we're looking forward to have the session tomorrow with George Eustatio, who's sitting humbly in the back. So we look forward for tomorrow's session.
Starting at 1.
Yes, so it's going to start at 1. We'll give you some coffee, so you're going to save some bucks on that.